we go through the respiratory volume stuff today. I'm also going to pull the cadaver out and we're going to look at the respiratory, and I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the digestive anatomy with you guys on the cadaver. The rest of the cadaver stuff is super simple compared to what we just finished last week. So I will pull the cadaver out after we go through the respiration, and you guys will have a chance to look at digestive and the respiratory anatomy on it. All right, so let me talk about the respiratory volumes here. Make my camera over here. All right, what are you doing on your respiratory volumes? First of all, I've given you all the formulas on there. You want to make sure you go through and you take the time to define those terms so you know what you're looking at. In your respiratory handout, then, you are to choose either the male or the female respiratory volume data. Usually you would do your own, but because we can't breathe, you're going to pick one of those subjects, and you're actually going to end up graphing the respiratory volumes. So let me talk about what a respiratory volumes graph looks like and what we're actually looking at on our respiratory volumes. So you have a sample graph that you see on the very first page of your handout, or maybe it's on your second page of your handout. And it looks something like this. You guys see that on your graph? Great. What are we looking at? So there's some lines going through here, sort of like this. And you have a line down here. And to make sense of this graph, what you're going to see all these little kind of areas or zones for respiration. So this very bottom zone right here is called your residual volume. I'm going to put RV for residual volume. What is residual volume? Residual volume is what is left in your lungs that you cannot exhale. You can't even forcibly exhale it. With your lungs, your alveoli, your little air sacs, there's liquid down in your lungs to some extent, some water in there, water vapor, things like that. One thing we learned about water is that water is polar. You guys all remember about learning about the polarity of water. What does that mean when you have one water molecule that's polar and another water molecule that's polar? What's going to happen to my water molecules if they're both polar? They're going to attract and stick to each other, right? So in our alveoli, we have these water molecules, and if we didn't keep some amount of air in our alveoli, what would happen is when all the air got expelled from our lungs, the water molecules found in our alveoli would stick together. So we'd have these squished little flat sacs, air sacs. And to take our next inspiration, we would have to overcome the pole of our opposing molecules to reinflate our lungs. And it would take a tremendous amount of effort and a tremendous amount of pressure to pull those water molecules back apart and reinflate our sacs. So we keep a small amount of air in your air sacs even when you forcibly exhaled, and it is the amount of air that it takes to keep your alveoli inflated so that they don't stick together and we don't have to overcome that attraction, that water molecule. We also have a secretion that your lungs secrete called surfactant, which also helps to reduce the polarity of those water molecules sticking together. So with surfactant and our residual volume, which is what keeps our air sacs inflated, now we don't, with every breath, have to put so much effort in that we're reinflating our alveoli. So really, that's what your residual volume is. There is no way you can get rid of the residual volume in your lungs. You sometimes will hear about people like have a collapsed lung or something. Those are the cases where we actually have gotten rid of the residual volume in your lungs. So that's what this bottom amount is. It depends on if you're male or female. You'll see on your chart, if you go to 0.9, you can tell me if I'm right because I haven't looked at it for a while. 0.9 for women, 1.1 for men. Is that right? I think that's what I gave you on there. For your residual volume, that's the amount in there. 1.2, thank you. It was at liters or milliliters? Liters, that's what I thought. Okay, so this is the amount of air, and this is for females, and this is for males on your residual volume. That's how much air you keep in your lungs that you cannot forcibly expire. All right, this little line right here, I'm going to fix this a little bit now that I drew my lines in there. This right here is called our tidal volume. And tidal volume is basically, this is the amount of air we're breathing in and breathing out in a normal breath. So this would be my inhalation, exhalation, inhalation, exhalation, inhalation, exhalation. So this is the zone of air that I'm typically moving in and out of my lungs. This is the amount of volume I'm typically moving in and out of our lungs. If you do a normal inhalation, so if you just take a normal inhaling breath, you can forcibly inhale more air, right? We can take a normal breath and then we can like forcibly inhale more. This is called my inspiratory reserve volume. This is my forcibly inhalable air beyond normal breath. So that is my inspiratory reserve volume. And then this down here is my expiratory reserve volume. What is this? This is the amount of the air I can forcibly exhale after I do a normal exhale. So I can exhale and then I can keep forcibly exhaling. Can I ever exhale out all the air out of my lungs? No, because I'm going to keep some amount of air I can't exhale. I have no capability of exhaling this. This is what it takes to keep my air sacs inflated. So this is what we're looking at our graph. When you graph your graph, when you pick whoever it is you want to graph, you have to graph the zones. So you can either do it in liters of air over here, or you can do it in milliliters. If you do it in milliliters, you're going to have to convert these over to milliliter values over here. Just make sure your values are consistent. They're all in milliliters or they're all in liters. And what you're going to do is you're going to first graph your zone line. So I'm going to graph this line, this line, this line. And I'm going to go put my lines in where I need them. So if my residual volume, let's say I'm graphing a female, I would want to, let's say this is 1 liter here on this side. And I'm going to graph my residual volume zone. So I put it at 0.9. I graph my line across there. This is my residual volume. And then I say my expiratory reserve. I don't know, what's one of the expiratory reserves for females? 2.8. So this was the female expiratory. 1.6. That's okay. 1.6 expiratory reserve volume is the values that we gave you. So I'm going, that's this zone right here. So I have to add that zone onto my residual volume. So I'm going to go from 1, and I'm going to, let's say I did my values over here, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm going to add a 1.6 over here from 0.9. So I would add the 1, the 0.6, and then that would be the top of my expiratory reserve zone. And then I would add the value, the max value for my tidal volume, and then this up here. Then I would go back and add my lines. Technically, this would be time down here. I don't care about time. You can title this down here. You don't have to put these in the exact time chunks that they go in. Just go add your lines later. So you could just title this for either your female or your male, whichever you pick to do over here. But you can graph your zones, then go back and put your lines in that indicate whether it's tidal volume, expiratory reserve, residual volume. People struggle so much with this graph. It is a little tricky. It's a little different than what you've normally done because we have to graph the zones and then go put the line. Because we're not given, there really is a time value on this. Our equipment wasn't really set up to do all the exact time. It takes really precise to do all the time values. So just go add your lines back in afterwards to indicate those different respiratory values. So that's what all of those zones are. You should know the definition, so you're going to want to open up your lab book to the respiratory physiology portion, and you're going to want to read through those. For your upcoming exam on the respiratory system, just to give you guys a little bit of a preview of what you need to know, I also have it on the review sheet. You should be able to define your upper respiratory system versus your lower respiratory system. What is the upper respiratory system? Anybody know? Anybody been studying, pre-prepping? What is it? Yeah, everything above your larynx, basically. So it's going to be nose, the mouth area, really, and by that I mean oropharynx. So really your pharynx, what is our pharynx? How do we define the pharynx? Anybody know? Goes down to your voice box, basically. Your pharynx is basically your shared tubing between respiratory system and digestive system. So any part that we're sharing between the digestive system and the respiratory system, we're going to give the name pharynx to. So you have nasopharynx, that's going to be the tube up in the nasal area. You have oropharynx, which is going to be the part of the pharynx back behind the mouth. And then you have your laryngopharynx, which goes down into the larynx area. The larynx is basically kind of the top of the voice box. That is the point where we split out the digestive and the respiratory system into their own systems. If it goes digestive system, it routes back into the esophagus. If it goes respiratory system, it's going to route forward into the trachea. So the larynx is kind of where these two systems split and go their own way. So anytime we're talking pharynx, it's shared tubing. When we get to the larynx, we split them out. Larynx opens up into basically your voice box. It's where your vocal folds are. We have the epiglottis. What's the job of the epiglottis? Yeah, it's kind of the gatekeeper to our trachea. When we swallow liquid, when we swallow food, the epiglottis is going to collapse and cover the trachea, which is going to route the food and the drink back into the esophagus. So that's the job of the epiglottis, is it's kind of the gatekeeper to the trachea. All right, so that's upper respiratory system, is larynx and above. Lower respiratory system is basically going to be from the larynx down, all the way down to the alveoli. There are questions about the way that, like how it branches. It goes into the trachea. Your split into your bronchi is called the carina, and then you're going to go into your right and left bronchi. You're going to go into your segmental or lobular bronchi, your segmental bronchi, into your bronchi, into your alveoli. There's a great little picture of that in your textbook. I can't remember the exact page, but it's kind of on the upper right-hand corner of one of the respiratory anatomy pages in your textbook that really outlines all those branches. You should be aware of that. You should know all of the different tissue types in your respiratory system. So upper respiratory system, what's going to be the main objective of my tissues in the upper respiratory system? To protect. So how's it going to protect? What kind of structures are we going to see in our tissue to protect? What are we protecting from? So a little bit of damage, but it is damage. What's the damage come from? Foreign objects, right? Dust, dirt, particles that we breathe in. So what kind of cell structures would protect us from that? Well, that's immune system. You're not wrong, but just tissue type. What's a protective tissue thing? Yeah, ciliated, pseudostratified. The cilia, right? And then we slap some mucus on that cilia. And now what happens if we have mucus and we have cilia? Yeah, we can trap the particles in the mucus. We can sweep it up and out. with our cilia. So that upper respiratory, you're going to see a lot of those ciliated mucus-filled tissue types that are trapping and sweeping. They're also helping to warm and humidify air, which is also a protective thing, right? We don't want a shock of really cold air down into our lungs. So we're going to see warming and humidifying air coming down into our lungs as well. From our lower respiratory tract, we're not going to see as much of that when we get down into the bronchi and that kind of stuff. They're going to be more functional things that are trading oxygen types of things. So if you remember back to your histology, we get into the alveoli, and they're the simple squamous cells that are doing rapid diffusion. So take the time to go back through and just kind of track what are the tissue types in each area of the respiratory tract. There will be some questions on your exam about that, so it is worth your while to go back through and really look at each of those. You should also know the difference between external respiration and internal respiration. What is external? Anybody know already? They studied that far ahead? Well, what does it sound like when we say external respiration? Exhaling, we are trading with the outside world. That is your external respiration. So it is your respiratory tract and the atmosphere trading oxygen. That is our external respiration. So we're breathing in oxygen, we're putting it into our alveoli, into our bloodstream, and we're taking carbon dioxide from the bloodstream, we're putting it into our alveoli, we're exhaling it back into the atmosphere. That is external respiration. What is internal respiration? Well, what does it sound like? Inside the body, right? Internal respiration is now I have oxygen in my bloodstream, and let's say that oxygen in my blood goes to my arm. Does my arm tissue need oxygen? Yeah, because it's doing cell respiration, right? Do we need oxygen for cell respiration? Yes. So if I'm hypoxic, I don't have enough oxygen, my tissue in my arm is going to die, right? It has to have oxygen coming to it and blood flow coming to it. So the exchange of oxygen from my bloodstream into my tissues, maybe it's arm tissue, leg tissue, whatever, but we're letting the oxygen come out of the bloodstream, go to those tissues. We're picking up the carbon dioxide from those tissues, putting it into the bloodstream. That is my internal respiration. So when we're doing that trade between the bloodstream and body tissues of oxygen and carbon dioxide, that is internal respiration. So you definitely need to know the difference. It works on a pressure gradient, on a concentration, well, we call it partial pressure gradient. So a couple things to know when we look at the anatomy is we have some partial pressures. So if here's my guy right here, what's our main breathing muscle? The diaphragm. So the diaphragm goes like this, and we have our lungs up in this area. So here's a lung, here's a lung, here's our trachea coming down. That's actually not a very good drawing. Let's try it again. Okay, so here's our trachea coming down into our lung. How this works is it works on a pressure gradient. So we have pressure out in the atmosphere made up of partial pressures of oxygen. We have carbon dioxide, we have nitrogen in the outside world. And what happens when we go to do respiration is we're basically thinking of changing the size of your container, thinking about things moving and bumping into each other, kinetic energy of particles. What happens when we have a lot of particles and they're bumping into each other? There's a lot of pressure, so they're bumping into each other. What do those particles do? This is back all the way back to 111. Is that too long ago? You guys can't remember it all. Are they going to bump into each other more or less when there's more in a small space? More, which is going to make them do what? expand, and move away from each other, right? If you're walking down a really crowded hall with lots of people, you're constantly doing the oops, bump, move over, oops, bump, move over, right? If you're walking in a hall and you're the only one in the hall, just walk right down the middle of the hall, right? So the more particles there are, we bump and we move away, we expand. We try to move to the open space, right? So if I take a container, say this is my container and I have this many particles, and now I change the size of this same container and I put my particles into a smaller container, what's going to happen to my particles? I take 50 people in a 100-foot hall, and now I take that same 50 people and I put them in a 50-foot space. What's going to happen? They're going to get closer and they're going to bump into each other and have to move apart. Your respiratory system works by doing that. It takes the same number of particles, but it changes the size of the container. If I change the size of the container, do I put more pressure on the particles in the container? Yes. That's how your respiratory system works, is we're basically working on a pressure gradient. How much pressure are we putting on the particles in that container? So, and the amount of pressure that we have directs the air to either come in or to go out. So how this works is your diaphragm's the big player in this. Here's my diaphragm. When your diaphragm is relaxed, it is curved up like this. This is a relaxed diaphragm. So I have this container size. I breathed in. I have some particles in my lungs in here. If I do an inhalation, what happens to our diaphragm when we inhale is it actually, when it contracts, it pulls down like this. Did I change the size of my container? Yes, I made my container bigger all of a sudden, right? So now the particles are going to spread out and there's not as many particles per the size of the container as there was, right? So what happens, because I changed the pressure on my particles in the container, is the pressure ends up being higher out here in the atmosphere than it is in my lungs because I just made my container bigger. So what happens is air flows into my container because I all of a sudden just made all this more room. And there's more particles out here bumping around into each other than there is here. So these are going to flow down the pressure gradient into the bigger container until they're equal with the particles out here. Now, when I relax my diaphragm, it pushes up and all of a sudden it makes my container smaller. Now, as my container is smaller, I'm going to have more particles bumping around, more pressure on my particles than I have out here. Where's my particles going to go? They're going to go out. This is going to do exhalation. So how we inhale and exhale is we basically change the size of our container. We make our container bigger. Now the pressure is not so great. Air is going to come in. We make our container smaller. Pressure is greater. Pressure is going to flow out into the atmosphere. That's how the respiration system works. It's mostly active your diaphragm. If we want to do active respiration, which means forcible respiration, we can begin to engage more muscles. And this is one of the things, like when one of the questions on the review was something about ways that the body can increase oxygen during activities, like if you're exercising. This would be one of the ways that it can do. It can begin to actively respirate by recruiting muscles. So I can now change the size of my container in a more robust way than just my diaphragm by really expanding my rib cage and my chest cavity to the max amount. What muscles did you learn in 201 that expand the rib cage? Intercostals. Which intercostals? You remember which ones lift and expand? I'm impressed you remembered intercostals. External. Your external intercostals. These guys, if you actively really recruited them, we can really expand our chest cavity. So by actively recruiting these muscles, we can make our container even bigger. Other muscles that get recruited in that are your scalenes. You guys did not learn about your scalenes in 201. I always kind of mention it to my class, just because I know we talk about it in 202. Anybody know where the scalenes are? Your scalenes are actually on the side of your neck, and you're like, how in the world does that help? Well, they actually attach to your first few ribs. So as you inspire, your scalenes help to lift and expand those top few pairs of ribs. So they're also going to help with making our container bigger. If I wanted, so that's the inhalation part of active respiration. What are some muscles that would do forcibly expire? What muscles would help us to forcibly expire? Who's the opposite to external intercostals? Internal intercostals. So these guys can squeeze my container down and make it even smaller if I engage those muscles. Any others that you can think of? A little bit, you can get into some of your abdominal muscles a little. We can really contract our abdominal muscles. But really, the big guy there is going to be internal intercostals. So another way we can affect the amount of oxygen coming into our body through respiration is actively recruiting muscles. When we are just standing there and we're not exercising, are we sitting there really sucking in and engaging those muscles? No, it's probably our diaphragm doing 99% of the work when we're just standing there. But as we go exercise, now we forcibly begin to engage some of these other muscles, which is going to help to increase like the sort of the elasticity and the rebound of our container. We can affect our container size, which is going to help to recruit more oxygen flow back and forth. Increased respiration rate just through increased heartbeat, things like that are also going to help to change the amount of airflow. All right, so I think that's the big thing as far as, do you guys have any other questions? I'm just trying to help you a little bit, direct you on your studying for your respiratory system. Any other questions that you might have? Have you guys kind of dug into the review a little bit? You've done okay with it so far? I don't think the respiratory system's terribly hard. It really goes with the blood system when you guys were learning in the blood about engaging or pulling oxygen in using hemoglobin, and then we take our carbon dioxide and we're converting it to transfer it back to the lungs. This really is going to tie into that as well, especially the internal respiration part. What was internal respiration again? Cell respiration, basically, right? When things are going from the blood into our tissues and back. And if we get into internal respiration, if we have our tissues, are our tissues constantly using oxygen? Yes. And if we have tissues that are exercising, are they going to be using more oxygen? Yes, because it takes ATP to exercise, right? And how do we make ATP? We use oxygen and glucose. So when we get into internal respiration, what we're going to see is we're going to have, as we get down to the tissues, we're going to have a higher, this is my bloodstream here, higher O2 content and a low CO2 content. Why? Because we're carrying the oxygen that came from the lungs. We get to these cells, are these cells used, and they're in the tissues, they're dumping their CO2 out and their water out. And they took O2 in, but they've used that O2, so they're really low in O2 because they're using that O2, which means our interstitial fluids are low in O2. Why? Because that's going into the cells and the cells are using it up. So now I look at my bloodstream and I just look at concentration gradient. Where's oxygen going to go from my bloodstream? It's going to go into my interstitial tissues, which are going to go into my cells. Where's the CO2 that came out of my cells going to go? Into the bloodstream. It all follows the concentration gradient. There's a great illustration in your textbook on this too that I really like. And if you're struggling with the concept, I'd definitely go back. Let me look. I can tell you guys. Do you want me to tell you the page of it? Let me find it here real quick. So your segmental, I just saw it here, where it talks about the different branches is on page 845. It's up in the upper right-hand corner. That kind of goes through how it branches down when you're looking at the anatomy of it. And it's on page 863. This is internal respiration. And it shows the concentration gradients. I really like that photo on there as well. It shows your partial, it gets into the exact partial pressures. What is partial pressure? Anybody know? What's that? Well, yeah, to some extent, yeah. So when we breathe in air, is it all one thing? Is it straight oxygen? No. What all's in our air? You guys know? What is it? Nitrogen, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and some water. Those are the things that are found in your air. What is atmospheric pressure? You should know this. Yes, 760 millimeters of mercury. Is that right? Mercury's H2, yeah. So with our 760, this is not straight oxygen. It is made up of oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water. So when we talk partial pressure, and if you look at the photo that I just gave you on page 863, it shows the partial pressures of things. What does that mean? Out of the 760, what percentage of it is oxygen? That would be the partial pressure of oxygen, meaning it's part of this 760. What oxygen is part of this? What amount of nitrogen is part of this? That is what your partial pressure is. And so when you look at this particular picture, it's showing you basically the amount of oxygen that's in the cells versus the amount of oxygen that's in the bloodstream. And you can see why oxygen moves down its concentration gradient. You can see why carbon dioxide moves down its concentration gradient. So when we're talking about partial pressure, that's what we're talking about. Of the total pressure, what component of it is made of oxygen, what component is made of nitrogen or oxygen, whatever. The big ones we really look at are the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, obviously. All right, does that help? I just wanted to take, we have plenty of time, so I wanted to take a little time and try to kind of help you guys out a little bit with your respiration anatomy and the way things move in and out. Is there anything else I can help you guys out with? Yes. Respiration handout will be due next week. So you will fill it out. You'll bring it back to me next week. I'll collect it. I actually take time and really go through it and grade it. I will tell you one of the hardest things I grade on it is the graph. So you really want to take your time, do your graph correctly. You should be able, with the data that we gave you, since we can't do the breathing, you should be able to complete the whole thing using the data that we gave you. All right, any other questions? Okay, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn you guys loose, and you're